Hi, I'm Marc and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on the politics in Africa and Arabia. The European Ombudsman is investigating against the EU Commission, and you will want to know Africa, because of flights and hotel accommodation donated by the Gulf Emirate of Qatar. In a letter to Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen on Monday, Ombudsman Emily O'Reilly asked for information on how the agency handles requests for business trips from its senior staff that are paid for by third parties. At the same time, O'Reilly is asking the Commission to change its rules and disclose travel expenses paid by third parties. Specifically, the investigation is about travel by the head of the Directorate General for Mobility and Transport. That means the highest official under the reasonable EU Commissioner Adina Vălean. According to the Politico magazine, he had flown business class with Qatar Airways for free several times since 2015. 4 of those flights were paid for by the Qatari government or groups close to the government. According to a spokeswoman for the EU Commission, costs for hotel accommodation were also covered. At the same time, the EU Commission negotiated a flight agreement with Qatar. This raises the legitimate question of possible undue influence on EU decision-making in this area, emphasized O'Reilly. Qatar is already the focus of a bribery scandal involving the European Parliament that became public in December. The country is accused of influencing political decisions. Several MEPs are in custody on suspicion of corruption and money laundering, among other things. As a spokesman for the EU Commission explained on Monday, the official in the present case adhered to all applicable rules. Accordingly, as head of the general management, he is responsible for examining possible conflict of interest in cases that affect him personally. At the same time, the authority announced that it intended to tighten the existing rules. In the future, travel expenses should only be accepted by third parties if they are from the United Nations, the G7 or G20. Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli announced on Wednesday that several ministries had been moved to the new administrative capital. He did not say how long the gradual relocation of all ministries, government departments and embassies should take. The hitherto unnamed capital is around 45 kilometers east of Cairo. Egypt had already announced the construction of the city in 2015. For President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who has ruled the northeastern country with an iron hand since 2014, the new administrative center is the largest in a whole series of mega projects. Critics suspect that the authoritarian government in the province feels better protected from the people and their anger. However, at some point 6.5 million people are supposed to move to the newly built metropolis. Thousands of residents have already been resettled there. Egypt currently has around 103 million inhabitants and the population is growing rapidly. Altogether, dozens of new cities are to be built in the country. According to estimates by the World Bank, the earthquake disaster in the Turkish-Syrian border region, which killed tens of thousands, caused property damage in the billions in Syria alone. The World Bank puts the damage around $5.1 billion, according to a report published on Friday. However, since this preliminary assessment is subject to considerable uncertainties, the actual damage could be significantly lower or higher. The range is therefore between 2.7 and 7.9 billion US dollars. The reconstruction costs could be twice as high. President Cyril Ramaphosa has appointed an electricity minister in response to South Africa's major energy problems. The newly created office was taken over on Monday evening by the previous head of the National Infrastructure Investment Authority, that is Kosientso Ramaphosa. As Minister of Electricity, he reports directly to the President. At the presentation in the capital Pretoria, Ramaphosa assured this minister will stay in office for as long as it takes to solve the energy crisis. For many months, South Africa's approximately 60 million inhabitants have been without electricity on and off, up to 11.5 hours every day. The multi-hour failures have plunged the country into a deep economic crisis. At the beginning of February, Ramaphosa declared a disaster in order to free up additional money from the budget to combat the energy crisis. The governing African National Congress, or ANC party, took a similar approach to combat the coronavirus. Alongside the newly electricity minister, Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe, an influential advocate of South Africa's coal economy, remains in the cabinet. The state-owned energy producer Eskom, which is responsible for 90% of the electricity supply, generates electricity with the help of coal-fired power plants. The company has a debt of over 21 billion euros and is accused of corruption and mismanagement. In addition, power plants and infrastructure in South Africa are outdated and poorly maintained. Only recently has the government been willing to invest seriously in renewable energy. He can't find a solution to the serious economic crisis while the need in Tunisia continues to grow. And thousands of people have therefore demonstrated again against President Kais Saied's political course. It was one of the largest protests since the head of state began his controversial expansion of power at the expense of other democratic institutions. Because despite the new abundance of power, Saied is not bringing the country forward, and according to surveys, his popularity ratings have recently fallen sharply. That's why he relies on aggression. The president is taking increasingly drastic action against his critics and recently also against refugees. Repression and tyranny will not exist in Tunisia, said the General Secretary of the influential trade union federation UGTT, Noureddin Taboubi. The trade unionists had called for the protests in the capital, Tunis. They've become one of the president's most important opponents. Some demonstrators called for an end to the liberties of the police state. Dozens of Saied's critics have been arrested in Tunisia since February, including opposition politicians, judges, a journalist and a representative of the UGTT. They are accused of corruption and conspiracy against state security. Human Rights Watch, on the other hand, criticized that there was no solid evidence for the allegations. The citizens of Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, who have been hit by a dramatic shortage of cash after a failed reform, are allowed to pay with their old banknotes until the end of the year. The country's Supreme Court ruled on Friday in the capital Abuja after 16 of the 36 states had sued. New notes are hard to come by, while the old Naira banknotes should have been invalid since early February. A large part of the approximately 220 million inhabitants could not pay for food, medicine, or the way to work. There were riots in front of banks, deadly protests, and a thriving black market. The central bank announced in autumn that it would replace the notes in the highest denominations of 1,000, 500, and 200 Naira. 1,000 are about 2 euros, by the way. The declared goal of the reform was to make counterfeiting and money laundering more difficult and to give the central bank more control over the money in circulation. Most of the old banknotes are hoarded outside of the banking system. The reform shortly before last weekend's presidential elections was also seen as a means of making voter buying, which is widespread in Nigeria, more difficult. Neither the government nor the central bank initially reacted to the ruling. On Wednesday, after an election marked by mishaps and allegations of fraud, the electoral authorities declared the candidate of the ruling APC party, Bola Tinubu, the winner and successor to incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari. The opposition sees the election result as invalid and wants to go to court. And this concludes this week's report on politics in Africa and Arabia. I'll see you in my next video. There are a lot out there. There's one in the end screen. Just have a look. I'll be back.